A little girl broke away from her father's hand in the middle of a crowded airport and ran straight at a stranger. She had not spoken one word in 8 months. Not to her father, not to her grandmother, not to the doctors who sat her down with soft toys and softer voices, trying to coax something, anything, out of her. 8 months of silence, and then, without warning, in the middle of Incheon International, she picked a stranger out of hundreds of people and ran. Delphine Jones was crouched by her cart, retying her shoelace and half listening to her coworker complain about a passenger who tried to bring a whole fish through security, when small hands grabbed her wrist. She looked up, startled, ready to laugh it off as some kid who mistook her for someone else, but the girl's eyes were locked on hers with an intensity no 8-year-old should carry. The girl leaned in close, put her mouth near Delphine's ear, and whispered one sentence. Delphine's whole body went still. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She stared at the girl's face, searching it for a joke, a mistake, anything that would make what she just heard make sense. It didn't. Before she could ask a single question, a man's voice cut through the noise, frantic, calling the girl's name, Yedji, and security stepped in, prying the two of them apart like they'd witnessed a crime. Yedji went rigid the second her father's hand closed around her shoulder. Whatever had opened up in her for those 10 seconds closed shut again, and she stood there blank-faced, like none of it had happened. Delphine stayed crouched on the floor a second longer than she needed to, her heart pounding for no reason she could explain to herself. She was a grown woman. She had pulled 12-hour shifts in an emergency room back home, had held a man's hand while he died, had seen things no training prepared her for, and still, a child's whisper in an airport terminal had rattled her more than any of that. My very own story lovers, I want you to do something for me. If this story is already pulling at you, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss what Yedji whispered and why it changed everything. Alright, let's get back into it. The man crouching in front of his daughter was An Chang-min. Delphine didn't know his name yet, only that his suit looked like it cost more than her rent, and his hands were shaking like a man who had nothing left to lose. He kept saying his daughter's name, soft and pleading, like he was trying to talk her back from somewhere far away. She hasn't spoken in 8 months, he said, straightening up, finally looking at Delphine properly. His English was careful, deliberate. She just ran to you. She never runs to anyone. Delphine stood, brushing off her knees, buying herself a second to think. She said something to me, she admitted. I don't know if I should tell you what it was. Please. His voice cracked on the word. Please. Whatever it was. Please. Delphine studied him. Not his suit, not his obvious wealth, but his face. The exhaustion under his eyes. The way his hands hovered near his daughter, like he was scared she'd disappear if he stopped watching her. She recognized that kind of fear. She'd seen it on the faces of parents in hospital corridors more times than she could count. I'll tell you, she said slowly, but not all of it, not here. He blinked, thrown off by her answer. Most people who worked around him did whatever he asked, whenever he asked it. This woman, a stranger in an airport uniform, was negotiating with him. My name is An Chang-min, he said, like that would change things. I know who you are, Delphine said, and something in her tone made it clear she wasn't impressed. I read the news like everybody else. That doesn't mean I owe you my whole day. A small, disbelieving huff of air left him. In the middle of the worst version of his week, someone had just made him almost laugh. Then what do you want? He asked. For starters, an explanation for why your daughter picked me out of a whole terminal to whisper to. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know why. I just know she hasn't done anything like that since her mother died. The word hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them expected. Delphine looked down at Yedji, who was staring at the floor, arms wrapped around herself, small and closed off like a door somebody had slammed shut a long time ago. Delphine had planned to work her shift, go home, and sleep. Instead, she found herself standing in the middle of an airport, holding a piece of a stranger's grief in her hands, unsure whether to hand it over or keep it safe a little longer. Give me your number, she said finally. Not because I'm scared of you, because that little girl needs someone to actually listen to her, and I don't trust everyone standing around her to do that. Chang-min handed her his phone without hesitation, something loosening in his shoulders for the first time since Delphine had looked up at him. She typed her number in, watching Yedji out of the corner of her eye the whole time. The girl hadn't moved. I'll call you tonight, Delphine said. Not tomorrow, tonight. Because whatever she said to me, I don't think it can wait. She walked away without looking back, though she could feel his eyes following her the entire length of the terminal. Her hands were still trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs as she walked, trying to steady herself. What Yedji had whispered wasn't a cry, or a scream, or a single broken word, the way silence-breaking moments were supposed to sound. It was a name. And underneath the name, 4 words that Delphine couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried to focus on anything else for the rest of her shift. He was there too. Delphine sat on the edge of her bed that night with her phone in her hand for almost 20 minutes before she called. She lived alone in a small apartment 20 minutes from the airport, the kind of place with thin walls and a landlord who never fixed anything on time. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Paid for with her own 2 hands after she left nursing behind and needed something that didn't ask so much of her heart every single day. Funny how life worked. She thought she'd left heartbreak behind in that hospital. Instead, it had followed her straight to an airport terminal in the shape of an 8-year-old girl. When Chang Min picked up, his voice sounded different than it had at the airport. Less composed, like he'd been pacing his house waiting for her call. "Thank you for calling," he said. "I said I would. Most people say a lot of things." "I'm not most people," Delphine said, and she meant it as a joke, but it landed with more weight than she intended. There was a pause on the line. She could hear something in the background. Maybe a television, maybe just the quiet of a big house that felt too empty. "What did she say to you?" he asked. Delphine exhaled slowly. She had rehearsed this moment in her head the whole way home, trying to figure out how much to give him, how much to hold back. In the end, she decided honesty, even partial honesty, was better than games. "She said a name," Delphine said. And then she said, "He was there too." Silence stretched out on the other end of the line, long enough that Delphine checked to see if the call had dropped. "Whose name?" Chang Min finally asked, his voice quieter now. Delphine hesitated. This was the part she'd debated the most. Handing over a name felt like handing over a weapon to a man she barely knew, in a situation she didn't fully understand yet. "I'm not giving you that yet," she said. "Not until I understand what I just walked into. You said she hasn't spoken since her mother's accident. I need you to actually tell me what happened that night. Not the version in the papers, the real one. Why does that matter to you?" His tone wasn't accusing, just genuinely confused. "You could take the money I'm about to offer you and never think about my family again." "Because I used to be a nurse," Delphine said. "I spent years learning how to tell when someone's hiding pain instead of healing from it. Your daughter isn't just sad, Chang Min. She's protecting something. And usually when a child protects a secret that long, it's because some adult around her taught her it wasn't safe to tell it." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its polish completely. "My wife died in a car accident 8 months ago," he said. "Yedji was in the back seat. The police said Jiun lost control on a wet road. Single vehicle, no one else involved." "And you believed that?" "I didn't have a reason not to. I was drowning in grief. You don't investigate your own wife's death when you're busy trying to explain to an 8-year-old why her mother isn't coming home." Delphine closed her eyes. She understood grief enough to know he wasn't lying, at least not about that part. "I want to help Yedji," she said. "But I'm telling you now, if I take this on, I'm not doing it as some quiet employee who smiles and nods. I'll tell you the truth even when it's ugly. I need to know that's something you actually want, because a lot of powerful men say they want the truth right up until they get it." "I want the truth," Chang Min said without hesitation. "I've wanted it for 8 months. I just didn't know I was allowed to ask for it." There was something in the way he said that last part that stuck with Delphine long after she hung up the phone. 3 days later, Delphine walked through the gates of the An family home for the first time. It sat on a quiet street on the edge of Seoul. Tall gates, a long driveway, more house than any one family needed. She wasn't intimidated by it. If anything, the size of it made her more suspicious. Big houses were good at hiding things. A housekeeper met her at the door, an older woman named Miss Bang, who looked Delphine up and down with obvious curiosity before offering a small, warm smile. "You're the one Yedji spoke to," she said. "The whole house has been talking about it. Word travels fast." "In this house, word is all we have most days," Miss Bang said. And there was something tired behind her eyes when she said it, like she'd witnessed more silence in that house than any person should have to. Delphine found Yedji in a sitting room near the back of the house, curled up on a couch with a sketchbook in her lap, drawing something Delphine couldn't see from the doorway. She didn't rush over. She remembered enough from her nursing years to know that trust wasn't something you demanded from a traumatized child. It was something you waited for, patiently, without making it obvious you were waiting at all. She sat down at the far end of the couch, far enough to not crowd her, and simply said, "Hey." Yedji didn't look up, but she also didn't move away. "I'm not going to ask you to talk," Delphine said. "I know everybody's been asking you that for months. And I bet it's annoying by now." The corner of Yedji's mouth twitched. Barely. But Delphine caught it. "I like your drawing," Delphine added, glancing at the sketchbook without trying to peer too closely. "Can I sit here while you finish it?" Yedji nodded, one small nod. It wasn't a word, but for the first time since Delphine had arrived, it felt like a door left open, even if only a crack. The first 2 weeks in the On household passed slower than Delphine expected and faster than she was ready for. She learned the rhythm of the house the way she used to learn the rhythm of a hospital ward, who was quiet in the mornings, who avoided eye contact, who talked too much because silence made them nervous. Miss Bang fell into the second category, always filling space with small updates about the garden or the weather, as if noise could patch over the grief soaked into the walls. Yedji was slowly unfreezing, in small, careful ways. She started leaving her sketchbook open when Delphine walked in, like an invitation. She began nodding more, shaking her head when she disagreed, tugging Delphine's sleeve when she wanted her attention, instead of simply staring blankly the way she used to. It wasn't speech, but it was communication, and Delphine treated every scrap of it like something precious. Changmin, though. Changmin was a different kind of project entirely. He was polite to the point of exhausting, formal in a way that made Delphine want to shake him sometimes. He thanked her for things that didn't need thanking. He asked permission before asking simple questions, like he was scared of overstepping some line neither of them had drawn. "You know you live in your own house, right?" Delphine said one evening, after he apologized for interrupting her while she sat with Yedji in the kitchen. "You don't need my permission to talk to your own daughter." "I don't want to make things harder for her," he said. "You seem to know how to talk to her better than I do." "That's not because I'm magic," Delphine said. "It's because I'm not carrying the same guilt you are." Kids can smell guilt on their parents. It makes them cautious. Changmin sat down slowly across from her, like her words had physically stopped him mid-motion. "Do you think she blames me?" he asked, quiet enough that Yedji upstairs wouldn't hear even if she'd been in the room. "I think she's carrying something that has nothing to do with blaming you," Delphine said carefully. "But I won't know for sure until she tells me herself." That was the night Delphine first noticed the flinch. A man came by the house unannounced. Someone the staff greeted with familiarity, someone Changmin called by name, with the ease of a person greeting family. He introduced himself to Delphine as Yuntae, the late Ji-eun's cousin, a frequent presence in the house since before the accident. He was charming in the practiced way of men who had spent their whole lives being liked, complimenting Delphine's work with Yedji, asking easy questions about her background, smiling in all the right places. Yedji, who had been sitting at the kitchen table drawing, went still the moment he walked in. Not shy still, not tired still. Frozen, the way a small animal freezes when it senses a predator nearby. Her pencil stopped moving. Her shoulders climbed toward her ears. She didn't look up once the entire time Yuntae stood in that kitchen, even when he spoke directly to her, ruffling her hair like uncles do, calling her sweet and clever like it cost him nothing. Delphine noticed it because noticing things like that used to be her job. In the ER, you learned to read a body before it told you anything with words, the way a patient's leg bounced when they were hiding something, the way their eyes darted to a spouse before answering a question about how they'd gotten hurt. Yedji's whole body was screaming something that her mouth couldn't say, and nobody else in that kitchen seemed to notice it but Delphine. She filed it away and said nothing that night. But she didn't forget it either. A few nights later, unable to sleep, Delphine found herself back in her old world without meaning to. She sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, pulling up the public accident report on her phone, the same one every news outlet had run 8 months ago. Single vehicle, wet road, loss of control. A tragedy, clean and simple, the kind that made for a short news cycle and an easy explanation. But Delphine had spent years reading injury reports before she ever read a headline, and something about the described injuries nagged at her the longer she stared at the screen. A single vehicle skid off a wet road typically produced a certain pattern of trauma. The body thrown one direction, injuries consistent with a single point of impact. What she remembered from the hospital records Changmin had once mentioned in passing, injuries Yedji had sustained that night, didn't match that pattern at all. They matched something closer to a collision. Something hit them, or they hit something else. And no report anywhere mentioned a second vehicle. Delphine sat with that thought for a long time, the kitchen dark around her, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. She thought about Yedji's silence, about the flinch at Yuntae's name, about 4 whispered words in the middle of a crowded airport. He was there too. The next morning, she found Changmin in his study before Yedji woke up, and she didn't waste time easing into it. I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about the answer instead of giving me the version you've told yourself for 8 months, she said. He looked up from his desk, immediately alert. All right, did anyone ever ask why Yedji's injuries from that night don't match a single car accident? The color drained slowly from his face. What are you talking about? Delphine pulled out her phone, showing him the discrepancy she'd found, laying it out the way she used to lay out patient charts for confused family members, plainly, without softening the truth to protect anyone's feelings. I'm not saying this to hurt you, she said. I'm saying it because I don't think your wife's death happened the way everyone decided to believe it did. And I think your daughter has known that for 8 months and has been too scared to say it. Changmin stared at the screen for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were wet, but his voice was steady in a way Delphine hadn't heard from him before. Then help me find out what actually happened, he said. Please. They started slow, careful not to alarm anyone in the house who might carry word back to the wrong ears. Changmin pulled old phone records from the month before the accident, something he admitted he should have looked at 8 months ago, but couldn't bring himself to touch while grief still had its hands around his throat. Delphine sat beside him at his desk late one night, going through call logs, timestamps, anything that might explain the gap between the official story and what her instincts and Yedji's silence were both screaming at her. She called Yuntae 11 times the week before she died, Changmin said, staring at the screen like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less painful. I never noticed. I was traveling that month. Work trip. 11 calls isn't unusual for family, Delphine offered gently, though she didn't fully believe it herself. It is when he's supposed to be nothing more than her cousin, Changmin said, and something in his voice cracked open, old suspicion finally given permission to surface. I always thought they were close because of their mothers being sisters. I never thought, he stopped himself before finishing the sentence, like saying it out loud would make it undeniably true. Delphine reached over and placed her hand lightly over his on the desk, not romantic, just steady, the way she used to hold a patient's hand before delivering news that would change their life. We don't know anything for certain yet, she said. Let's not build a story before we have the pieces. That's how people get hurt chasing the wrong thing. He nodded, though his jaw stayed tight the rest of the night. Underscore. Over the following days, Delphine watched Yedji even more closely, looking for the smallest signals. She started leaving crayons and paper out during their afternoons together, not asking Yedji to draw anything specific, just letting her fill pages however she wanted. Most of the drawings were ordinary. Flowers, the family dog that had passed years ago, stick figure versions of her mother smiling. But one afternoon, Yedji drew 2 cars. Delphine noticed it immediately, her heart picking up pace as she watched Yedji's small hand carefully draw a second vehicle beside the first one, closer than any juju would normally be, angled like impact. Yedji, Delphine said softly, keeping her voice as gentle as she could manage, despite the thundering in her chest. Can you tell me about this drawing? Yedji's hand froze over the paper. For a long moment, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the 2 cars she'd drawn. Then, slowly, she shook her head and pushed the paper away, closing the sketchbook with a soft, final thud. Delphine didn't push. She simply sat with her, quiet, present, letting Yedji know that whatever she wasn't ready to say yet would still be safe to say later. That night, lying awake in the guest room the An family had given her, Delphine found herself thinking about more than the mystery. She thought about the way Changmin had looked at her over his desk, the exhaustion and gratitude tangled together in his expression. She thought about how easy it had become to sit beside him in comfortable silence, something she hadn't expected from a man she'd met under such strange circumstances. She reminded herself, firmly, that she was here for Yedji, not for him, not for whatever strange warmth had started growing in her chest every time he said her name like it mattered to him. But reminding herself didn't make it any less true. Yuntae visited again 3 days later, and this time Delphine paid closer attention to everything. His tone, his questions, the way his eyes lingered on her a beat too long during ordinary conversation. "You've been spending a lot of time with our little Yedji," he said, smiling in that easy, practiced way of his. "I hear she's even been drawing again. That's wonderful progress." "She's a talented kid," Delphine said carefully, giving nothing away. "Chang Min tells me you used to be a nurse," Yoontae continued, his tone still light, still friendly, but his eyes sharper now, studying her like he was trying to read something beneath her expression. "Interesting career change. From saving lives to nannying, was it?" "Something like that," Delphine said, refusing to let the jab land the way he intended it to. "It must be strange," he said, "coming into a family like this, a stranger, suddenly so close to everything. People might start to wonder about your intentions." Delphine met his eyes without blinking. "People wonder about a lot of things. I try not to worry about what other people wonder. I worry about doing my job well." Something flickered across his face, brief but unmistakable. Irritation, maybe even the smallest flash of alarm, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced again by that easy, unbothered smile. "Of course," he said. "I only meant it as an observation." After he left, Delphine stood in the hallway for a long moment, replaying the conversation in her head. He hadn't said anything overtly threatening, nothing she could point to directly. But something about the exchange had left a cold feeling low in her stomach. The same feeling she used to get in the ER when a patient's story didn't add up and something in the room told her not to trust the person standing closest to them. She found Chang Min later that evening and told him everything, word for word. "He's trying to figure out how much I know," she said, "or how much Yedji's told me. Either way, he's watching me now too." Chang Min's expression darkened in a way Delphine hadn't seen from him before, something protective and furious stirring beneath his usual composed exterior. "Then, we need to be careful," he said. "But we don't stop. Not now." Delphine nodded, though a small part of her, the part that had learned long ago how dangerous it could be to poke at wealthy, well-connected men, wondered exactly how careful would need to be. The pressure started small, the way pressure like that always does. First it was a phone call from the visa office, unusual and unannounced, asking Delphine to come in and clarify a few details about her employment status. Nothing urgent, they said, just routine. But Delphine had lived long enough as a foreigner in someone else's country to know that nothing about a sudden, unscheduled visa review was ever truly routine. Then it was the whispers, not loud enough to confront, but present enough to notice. A staff member who used to greet her warmly now avoided eye contact. A comment from a family friend at a small gathering about how helpers shouldn't get too comfortable in a house that wasn't theirs. Small cuts, easy to dismiss individually, but Delphine had been cut enough times in her life to recognize a pattern when she saw one. She didn't tell Chang Min at first. She wanted to see how far it would go. And more than that, she didn't want him fighting battles for her that she was more than capable of fighting herself. Instead, she called an old friend from her nursing days, a woman named Farida, who now worked in hospital records administration, someone Delphine trusted with her life, quite literally, after the two of them had survived a brutal overnight shift together years ago that neither of them ever fully talked about afterward. "I need a favor," Delphine said over the phone, careful with her words even though she trusted the line. "I need you to help me pull an accident report from 8 months ago. Not the public version, the real intake records." "You know that's not exactly something I'm supposed to just hand out," Farida said, though there was no hesitation in her voice, only the familiar rhythm of two women who had trusted each other with far bigger secrets than this one. "I know," Delphine said, "but a little girl's whole life might depend on it." Farida was quiet for a moment. "Give me a few days. Underscore." While she waited, Delphine's afternoons with Yedji deepened into something that felt less like a job and more like a genuine friendship between two people who understood each other in ways words weren't always necessary for. Yedji started humming quietly while she drew small fragmented tunes that meant nothing on their own but felt, to Delphine, like tiny cracks of light breaking through months of darkness. One afternoon, sitting together in the garden, Yedji reached over and took Delphine's hand, holding it the way children hold the hands of people they trust completely. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Delphine sat there, throat tight, blinking back tears she refused to let fall in front of the child who needed her to be steady more than anything else. That evening, she found Chang Min sitting alone on the back porch, staring out at nothing in particular, a glass of something untouched beside him. "She held my hand today," Delphine said, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. "In the garden. Just reached over and took it." Chang Min's eyes softened instantly. She hasn't done that with anyone since her mother. "I know," Delphine said quietly. "That's what scares me a little." "Why would that scare you?" Delphine hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because that kind of trust is heavy, Chang Min. If I get this wrong, if I disappear from her life the way people sometimes do, I'm scared of what that would do to her." Chang Min turned to look at her fully then, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "Then don't disappear." The words hung between them, simple but weighted with more meaning than either of them was ready to name out loud. Delphine felt her heart do something complicated and unfamiliar, something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. "I'm not planning on it," she said finally, softer than she meant to. They sat there together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, the kind of silence two people share when words would only get in the way of something bigger settling quietly between them. 3 days later, Farida called back. "I found something," she said, her voice careful, measured in the way it always got when she was about to deliver news she knew would land hard. "The intake records from that night don't match the public report at all. The trauma pattern is consistent with a side impact collision. Whoever wrote the public accident report either made a serious mistake or someone made sure the real story never made it past the initial file." Delphine closed her eyes, her suspicion now confirmed in cold, clinical terms she couldn't argue with. "There's something else," Farida added. "There was a second call to emergency services that night. Not from Jiyun's phone, from a number registered to a car nearby. It came in almost 4 minutes before the official call that reported the accident." "Someone else was there," Delphine said quietly, more to herself than to Farida. "Someone was there," Farida confirmed, "and whoever it was left before anyone official arrived." Delphine thanked her friend, promised to explain everything properly when she could, and hung up the phone with shaking hands. She sat alone in the guest room for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, putting the pieces together in her mind, the way she used to piece together a diagnosis from scattered, confusing symptoms. A whispered name at the airport, a flinch in the kitchen, a drawing of 2 cars, a confirmed collision instead of a single vehicle accident, a second phone call from someone who fled the scene. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. One Delphine wasn't ready to say out loud yet, not until she had enough to make it undeniable. "My loves, I want you to pause for a second. If you're as invested in this story as I am telling it, do me a huge favor. Like this video. Drop a comment telling me who you think was really in that second car. And subscribe, because it's about to get a lot more intense from here." Delphine brought everything to Chang Min the next morning, laying it out on his desk the way she once laid out evidence for grieving families who needed the truth delivered plainly, without decoration. He read through it twice, his hands trembling slightly by the second pass. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his jaw was set with a kind of determination Delphine hadn't seen in him before. "I need to talk to Yedji," he said, properly. Not asking her to speak, just telling her I know, that she doesn't have to protect this alone anymore. "I think that's exactly what she's been waiting for," Delphine said gently. That evening, the 3 of them sat together in Yedji's room, the lights dimmed low, the atmosphere soft in a way that felt safe rather than forced. Chang Min knelt in front of his daughter, taking her small hands in his. "I know there was another car that night," he said quietly. "I know you saw something you've been carrying by yourself for a long time. I'm not asking you to tell me everything right now. I just want you to know that you're not alone anymore, and nobody is going to be angry with you for what you saw." Yedji's eyes filled with tears, her lower lip trembling. She looked from her father to Delphine, back and forth, like she was searching both their faces for permission she desperately needed but had never been given before. Delphine nodded softly at her, a silent promise passing between them. Yedji opened her mouth. For a long moment, nothing came out, just the shape of a word forming and dissolving before it could become sound. Then, in a voice so quiet it was barely more than breath, she said one word, "Uncle." Chang Min's whole body went rigid. "Yuntae?" Yedji nodded, tears spilling freely now, her small shoulders shaking. Delphine moved closer, wrapping an arm around her, letting her cry into her side while Chang Min sat frozen, processing the confirmation of something he had feared but hadn't allowed himself to fully believe. He was in the car, Delphine said gently, more statement than question, giving Yedji the chance to simply nod, instead of finding more words she wasn't ready to say yet. Yedji nodded again. Did he cause the accident? Changmin asked, his voice breaking on the question. Yedji hesitated, then shook her head slowly, and pointed instead toward the sketchbook sitting on her nightstand. Delphine reached over and grabbed it, flipping to the drawing of the two cars from days earlier. There was another car, Delphine said softly, putting the pieces together out loud for Yedji, so she wouldn't have to. Yuntae wasn't driving that one, was he? Yedji shook her head again, then, in the smallest whisper yet, added one more word. Brother. The room went completely silent. Underscore. It took another 2 days of careful digging to confirm what Yedji's single whispered word had revealed. Yuntae had a younger brother, a man named Seok-won, someone who mostly stayed out of family gatherings. Someone Delphine hadn't even known existed until she started pulling at every thread connected to that night. Farida, still quietly helping from her end, managed to confirm that the phone number attached to the mysterious second emergency call belonged to Seok-won. Piece by piece, the full picture began forming, uglier and more painful than any of them had expected. Jiun hadn't died in a random accident caused by wet roads and bad luck. She had been followed that night, confronted, pushed into a moment of panic behind the wheel that ended her life and nearly ended her daughter's. Changmin sat with this information for a long time, quiet in a way that worried Delphine more than if he had been angry. Talk to me, she said finally, sitting beside him. Don't shut down on me now, not after everything. I trusted him, Changmin said, voice hollow. He sat at my table. He held my daughter. He comforted me at my wife's funeral. And the whole time, he couldn't finish the sentence. Delphine reached over and took his hand, holding it firmly, letting him feel that he wasn't facing this collapse of trust completely alone. You're allowed to grieve the version of him you thought you knew, she said quietly. That doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. Changmin turned to look at her. Then, something shifting in his expression, something that had been building slowly for weeks, finally rising fully to the surface. I don't know what I would have done these past weeks without you, he admitted. You walked into chaos that had nothing to do with you, and you stayed anyway. I stayed for Yedji, Delphine said, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't the whole truth anymore. I know, Changmin said softly, but I hope, somewhere along the way, you started staying for more than just her. Delphine didn't answer right away. She didn't trust her voice to stay steady if she tried. But she didn't pull her hand away either. Word travels fast in houses full of staff who notice everything and say nothing. And it wasn't long before Yuntae realized something in the household had shifted. He showed up unannounced one afternoon, his usual charm slightly frayed at the edges, his eyes sharper, more calculating than Delphine had seen before. He found her alone in the garden, Yedji inside napping, and approached with the practiced smile of a man used to smoothing over problems before they became public. I hear Yedji's been talking again, he said lightly, though there was nothing light in the way his eyes studied Delphine's face for a reaction. She's made some progress, Delphine said carefully, giving away nothing. That's wonderful news, he said. Though I imagine, given everything this family has been through, it might be easy for a child that age to confuse things. Trauma does strange things to memory, doesn't it? Sometimes children construct stories to make sense of pain they don't understand. Are you suggesting she's lying? Delphine asked, her tone even, though her pulse had picked up considerably. I'm suggesting, Yuntae said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, more pointed, that outsiders sometimes mistake a grieving child's confusion for something more sinister than it is. And outsiders who push too hard into a family's private pain sometimes find themselves no longer welcome in delicate situations like this one. Delphine held his gaze without flinching, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her back down. I've spent years learning how to tell the difference between confusion and truth, she said calmly. Yedji isn't confused. And I think you know that better than anyone standing in this garden right now. Something flashed behind Yuntae's eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual composed smile. Be careful, Miss Jones, he said softly. Foreign workers in this country have less protection than you might think. A single complaint about your conduct with a vulnerable child could end your work authorization very quickly. I'd hate to see that happen to someone so clearly devoted to Yedji's well-being. He walked away before Delphine could respond, leaving the threat hanging in the warm afternoon air like something toxic. Delphine stood there for a long moment, arms crossed, jaw tight. She had faced difficult people before, arrogant doctors, dismissive administrators, patients' families who lashed out from grief. But something about the calm, calculated cruelty in Yuntae's threat settled into her chest differently. Not fear exactly, something closer to resolve hardening into something unbreakable. She found Changmin inside and told him everything, watching his expression darken with every word. "He's threatening you to protect himself," Changmin said, fury barely contained beneath his controlled tone. "I'm not scared of him," Delphine said firmly, "but I do think it means we're closer to the truth than he's comfortable with. People don't threaten you over nothing." "I won't let him touch your work authorization," Changmin said. "I'll handle it personally if I have to." "No," Delphine said, sharper than she intended. "I don't need you to fight my battles for me, Changmin. I need you to trust that I can handle myself, and focus on protecting Yedji. That's the priority here." "Not me." Changmin looked at her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with the worry in his eyes. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said quietly. "I don't say that lightly." Delphine felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. "Save the compliments. We've got work to do." That night, unable to sleep, Delphine sat with Yedji in her room, the two of them quiet in the soft lamplight, while Yedji drew, more freely now than she had in months. "He came to see me today," Delphine said gently, testing the waters carefully. "Your uncle, Yuntae." Yedji's pencil paused, her small shoulders tensing. "He said something that scared him," Delphine continued softly. "That means you and I are getting closer to something important. I know that's scary, but I want you to know something, okay? You are the bravest person I have ever met. Braver than grown adults twice your size. What you saw that night, what you've carried by yourself for 8 months, that would break most people. And you're still here, still drawing, still finding your voice again, piece by piece." Yedji looked up at her, eyes glassy, and for the first time, spoke a full sentence, quiet but clear. "I was scared they would hurt Daddy too." Delphine's heart cracked wide open at those words. She pulled Yedji into a gentle hug, holding her while the little girl cried softly against her shoulder. Months of held-back fear finally finding somewhere safe to land. "Nobody is going to hurt your daddy," Delphine whispered fiercely. "I promise you that." It was a promise she fully intended to keep, no matter what it cost her. The next blow came from somewhere Delphine hadn't fully prepared for. Changmin's mother, a formidable woman named Halmoni Su, requested a private meeting with Delphine one afternoon, her tone polite but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority beneath it. They sat in a formal sitting room Delphine hadn't been in before, tea served between them that neither woman touched. "You've done wonders for my granddaughter," Halmoni Su began, her English precise and clipped. "For that, our family owes you gratitude." "I care about Yedji," Delphine said simply. "That's not something I need thanks for." "Be that as it may," the older woman continued, "I understand you and my son have been investigating certain matters related to my daughter-in-law's death." Delphine kept her expression neutral. "We're trying to understand the truth of what happened to her, for Yedji's sake, and for Changmin's." Halmoni Su's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup. "Some truths, once uncovered, cannot be put back. My family has already survived one tragedy this year. I would not want to see us destroyed by a second one, manufactured from grief and speculation." "With respect," Delphine said carefully, "I don't think it's speculation when a child finally finds the courage to tell you what she witnessed with her own eyes." "Children misremember," Halmoni Su said, her tone hardening slightly, "especially children who have experienced trauma. I have known Yuntae's family for over 30 years. I refuse to believe." "With respect," Delphine interrupted, gentle but firm, "I don't think this is about what you refuse to believe. I think it's about protecting a version of your family's story that feels safer than the truth. I understand that instinct, I really do. But it's not fair to Yedji, and it's definitely not fair to Ji-eun, who isn't here to speak for herself anymore." The older woman's eyes flashed, but something in Delphine's steady, unflinching honesty seemed to catch her off guard, like she wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not by someone in Delphine's position within the household. "You overstep, Miss Jones." "Maybe," Delphine said, "but someone has to, or Yedji carries this silence her entire life, and Ji-eun never gets justice. I don't think either of those outcomes is something you actually want, even if it's easier to pretend otherwise." Halmoni Su said nothing further, simply studying Delphine for a long, tense moment, before rising and leaving the room without another word. That night, the pressure escalated further. Delphine received an official notice regarding her work visa, citing an anonymous complaint about the nature of her employment and questioning whether her role in the household violated the terms of her original work authorization. It wasn't a rejection, not yet, but it was clearly meant as a warning shot, an attempt to destabilize her position before she could dig any deeper. She sat with the notice in her hands, anger burning steady and controlled in her chest rather than panic. She thought of every difficult night in the ER, every moment she had to stay calm, while everything around her fell apart, and she called on that same steadiness now. She called Farida again. "They're trying to scare me off," Delphine said. "I need everything solid before this goes any further. Every record, every confirmed detail, all of it. I'll get you what you need," Farida promised. "Don't let them push you around, Delphine. You've survived worse than a paperwork threat." Delphine allowed herself a small, tired laugh. Feels different when it's someone's freedom on the line instead of just mine. "It's not just someone's freedom," Farida said pointedly. "It's a little girl's whole future. And from what you've told me, it sounds like it might be yours too, if you'd just admit that to yourself." Delphine didn't respond to that last part, though the words sat heavily with her long after the call ended. She found Changmin later that night, sitting once again on the back porch, staring into the dark. "They came at my visa," she said, sitting beside him, showing him the notice. His expression turned to something fierce and immediate. "I'll fix this immediately. I have lawyers, connections." "Changmin," she said, cutting him off gently, but firmly. "I appreciate that. I do. But I need to handle this on my own terms, not because a powerful man swooped in and made my problems disappear. If I let that happen, I lose the thing that makes me useful in all of this, my independence, my credibility." He looked at her, something aching and helpless in his eyes. "I can't stand watching them try to hurt you because of what you've done for my family." "Then don't watch helplessly," Delphine said, softer now. "Trust me instead. I've handled harder things than a paperwork threat from scared, guilty people." Changmin reached over slowly, taking her hand in both of his, holding it like something precious. "I trust you," he said quietly, "more than I've trusted anyone in a very long time." Delphine's heart pounded fiercely in her chest, the weight of his words settling somewhere deep and unfamiliar. For a moment, neither of them said anything else, the quiet between them full of everything they weren't quite ready to say out loud yet. The final piece fell into place 3 days later, when Farida sent over documentation that confirmed everything Yedji's small whispered words had already revealed. Sokwon's car had been at the scene. Phone records placed him following Jeon's vehicle for nearly 15 minutes before the crash. A voicemail Jeon had left for a lawyer friend the week before her death, discovered buried in an old phone backup Changmin hadn't thought to check until now, confirmed what none of them had expected walking into this. Yoon-tae hadn't simply been obsessed with Jeon emotionally. He had been pressuring her for months to sign over her share of a small coastal property she'd inherited from her own mother. Something personal, something that had nothing to do with the An family fortune at all. When she refused, threatening finally to tell Changmin everything, including the full extent of Yoon-tae's manipulation over the years, he panicked. That night, he and his brother followed her, tried to stop her, tried to force the conversation to go differently than it did. Jeon, frightened, swerved to avoid Sokwon's car cutting too close, and lost control on the wet road exactly the way the official report described, only leaving out the reason why. Changmin read through everything in silence, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles turned pale. "He didn't cause it directly," he said finally, voice hollow, "but he caused all of it." "Yes," Delphine said quietly, "and then he spent 8 months sitting at your table pretending to grieve alongside you." Changmin's jaw tightened, something cold and resolute settling over his features. "It's time to end this." He called a private, family-only meeting the following evening, inviting Yoon-tae under the pretense of discussing a minor family matter. Delphine stood quietly to the side as Changmin laid everything out on the table, methodically, without raising his voice, each piece of evidence landing like a blow Yoon-tae couldn't dodge. Yoon-tae's practiced charm cracked slowly, piece by piece, as denial gave way to desperate justification, and finally, when confronted with his brother's phone records and Jeon's own voicemail, silence. "I never meant for her to die," he finally said, voice small in a way it had never been before. "I only wanted to talk to her." Sokwon panicked. "It wasn't supposed to." "You spent 8 months letting my daughter carry that night alone," Changmin said, his voice deadly calm, in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. You sat across from her at dinner. You let her believe there was no one safe enough to tell. That's the part I will never forgive. Yoon-tae had no response for that. There wasn't one that could undo 8 months of a terrified child's silence. The legal and family fallout that followed happened quickly once the truth was undeniable. Halmoni Soo, confronted with the full evidence, finally abandoned her instinct to protect the family's image, and instead threw her support fully behind Chang-min, horrified at what she'd nearly helped bury. Yoon-tae and his brother faced the consequences the law required of them, consequences Delphine made sure, quietly and firmly, would not be softened by money or influence the way these things sometimes were in families like this one. That night, after everything had finally been said and confronted, Delphine found Yedji sitting alone in the garden, staring up at the sky. She sat down beside her without a word. "It's my fault," Yedji whispered eventually, her voice small. "If I had told everyone sooner—" "No," Delphine said immediately, firm and unwavering. "None of this was ever your fault. You were a little girl who watched something terrifying happen, and your mind protected you the only way it knew how. That's not weakness, Yedji. That's survival. You didn't fail anyone by staying quiet. You survived, and now you're brave enough to speak. Both of those things can be true at the same time." Yedji leaned into her side, and Delphine wrapped an arm around her, holding her while the stars came out slowly overhead. "Will you stay?" Yedji asked quietly after a while. "Even now that everyone knows the truth?" Delphine's throat tightened. "That's not really up to me alone, sweetheart. Then I'll ask Daddy to make sure it is," Yedji said, with the simple confidence of a child who had just found her voice again and intended to use it. Delphine laughed softly despite the tears gathering in her eyes, pulling Yedji closer. For the first time in a long time, sitting under a sky full of stars in a country that had never been her home, Delphine felt something settle in her chest that felt dangerously close to belonging. 3 weeks passed after the truth finally came out, and life in the An household slowly began reshaping itself into something that resembled peace instead of grief. Yedji spoke freely now, her voice filling rooms that had been silent for far too long, full of questions and jokes, and the ordinary chatter of an 8-year-old finally allowed to simply be a child again. She started school again, made a new friend within her first week, came home every afternoon with stories that had nothing to do with tragedy at all, only the small, wonderful dramas of childhood. Who sat where at lunch? Whose drawing the teacher praised the most? Delphine watched all of it unfold with a quiet, fierce pride she hadn't expected to feel this deeply for a child who wasn't her own. But even as things settled, an old fear crept up inside her, one she hadn't fully examined until now. She had come into this family as an outsider, hired to help a broken child heal. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, she had fallen into something bigger. Not just affection for Yedji, but something real and terrifying growing between her and Chang-min. And now that the crisis had passed, now that the house was calm again, Delphine found herself wondering, quietly, painfully, whether she still belonged here, or whether she'd simply been a temporary fixture in someone else's healing, easily replaced once the storm passed. She started debating a trip home, telling herself it was overdue, that her family back home deserved a visit, that maybe some distance would help her think clearly about what came next. She booked a flight without telling anyone, scheduled for the following week, and told herself it was simply practical, nothing more. Chang-min found out anyway, the way he always seemed to find out things that mattered. He found her in the kitchen the night before her flight, quiet, watching her pack a small bag of things she'd need for the trip. "You're leaving," he said, not a question. "Just for a visit," Delphine said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I have family I haven't seen in a long time." Delphine, his voice was quiet, but there was something underneath it, something raw and afraid. "Are you coming back?" She finally looked up at him, and the honesty in his eyes nearly undid her composure completely. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I came here to help Yedji. I did that. Maybe it's time I figure out where I actually belong, instead of just staying because it's comfortable." "Is that all this has been to you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Comfortable? That's not fair," Delphine said, her voice catching despite her best efforts to stay composed. "Then tell me what it is," Chang-min said, his voice breaking slightly, "because for me, these past months have been the first time since Jiun died that I've remembered what it feels like to actually want to wake up in the morning. Not because of Yedji's healing, though I'm endlessly grateful for that. Because of you. Because you challenge me, and you make me laugh when I forget how to, and you tell me the truth even when it's uncomfortable, And I don't know how to imagine this house without you in it anymore. Delphine stood frozen, her carefully built walls cracking under the weight of everything he'd just said. I'm scared, she admitted finally quietly. I'm scared of becoming someone who just fills a space left behind by someone else. I don't want to be a replacement for Jiun, or just someone Yedji clings to because I was there during the hard part. I want to be loved for exactly who I am, not for what I fixed. Changmin stepped even closer, taking her hands gently in his. You could never be a replacement for anyone, Delphine. You are entirely your own person, and that is exactly who I fell in love with. Not someone filling a gap, you. The word hung between them, simple and enormous all at once. Delphine felt tears finally spill over, months of held-back emotion breaking loose all at once. She didn't say anything, not right away, simply let herself feel the full weight of everything that had built quietly between them over these intense, transformative months. 2 days later, instead of boarding her flight home, Delphine stood at the same airport gate where this entire story had begun, except this time, she wasn't working a shift, and she wasn't leaving anyone behind. Yedji ran up to her the same way she had months ago, except now she was laughing, full of the easy joy of a child finally allowed to simply be happy. You're not getting on the plane, Yedji said, more statement than question, grinning up at her. Nope, Delphine said, smiling despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes again. Turns out I already found exactly where I belong. Changmin walked up behind his daughter, his expression soft, hopeful, everything he felt written plainly across his face for the first time since Delphine had met him. So, he said quietly, does this mean you're staying? Delphine looked between the two of them, this small, healing family that had somehow become hers too, and felt something settle deep and certain inside her chest. I'm staying, she said simply. Yedji whooped with delight, grabbing both their hands and pulling them toward the exit, chattering excitedly about all the things she wanted to do that weekend, completely unbothered by the weight of everything they'd all survived together to get to this exact, ordinary, wonderful moment. Delphine looked over at Changmin as they walked, and he looked back at her with an expression that said everything neither of them needed words for anymore. No grand kiss, no dramatic declaration shouted across the terminal. Just 3 people, finally safe, finally honest, walking out of an airport together into whatever came next. My loves, if you made it all the way to the end of this story with me, I need you to do one last thing before you go. Like this video, drop a comment telling me your favorite part of Delphine and Changmin's story, and subscribe so you're here for the next one, because trust me, there's so much more where this came from. Thank you for watching till the very end.